Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 6. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." As Jonah continues his trip to Tarshish, we immediately see that God is not bound by the laws of nature. Rather, he is completely sovereign over creation. In verse 4, by hurling a great wind upon the sea, God is using creation for his divine purpose, getting Jonah to Nineveh. He has allowed Jonah to travel this far, but no further. This is a stark contrast to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, where the Apostle Paul writes about people who put their trust in something or someone other than God. These people suppress the truth of God and exchange it for a lie. So in response, God lets them go. He gives them up to the lust of their hearts, to dishonorable passions, to a debased mind. God's presence is the only light in this world, but people reject it because they love darkness and their deeds are evil. You may have heard it said that this world, with its goodness and beauty, is the closest to heaven some people will ever get, because they reject God and his light, which is the true source of all goodness. For others who accept God, this world is the furthest from heaven they will ever be. Now, notice a detail that the author of this book does not add. It doesn't state that God was angry with Jonah, which we might associate with such a powerful storm, especially considering Jonah's behavior. Sometimes we read passages like this, and it conjures up scenes from those old mythological movies that had claymation monsters like Jason and the Argonauts or Clash of the Titans, where one of the many gods is angry at a human and interferes with his or her life. Applying that type of scenario to the God of the Bible is a gross injustice to the character of God. Romans 5:8 reads, "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Show me one God from the hundreds and thousands that man has created in the many world religions that willingly died for the human race to save it, while that same human race was still against it, still his enemy, still sinners. But that's the character of God. So this storm is not a reproach, it is a reminder. God is reminding Jonah who he is and who he is not. Jonah is not God. Jonah is one of God's chosen people, and he is also a servant of God. In the American culture, which professes personal wants and needs take priority, the idea of servitude is difficult to accept. It sounds a little bit like an authoritarian my way or the highway style of leadership. Many of us, myself included, might have come from a home where that was the style of parenting. However, applying this sinful parenting tactic to our Heavenly Father is wrong and damages the relationship from our perspective. Part of what it means to be a Christian is to trust that God knows better than we do. This trust is meant to be lived out when things don't make sense, when we don't know the results, or when we are in turmoil. God's goodness is not dictated by our circumstances. A moment ago, we discussed words that the author of this book left out, but now we're going to examine a detail they made sure to communicate. In verse 5, we see that Jonah was asleep. The word used for sleep refers to a deep slumber. So it was quite possible that Jonah was ignorant of all the activity aboard the ship. But I wonder if this also provides insight into the timing of the events. Was the storm still approaching? And by its great size and the way it affected the sea, creating enormous waves, could the sailors tell that it was going to rip the ship apart? Is this why they started throwing cargo overboard, so that the ship might maneuver better? Why would they do that if the storm was upon them? Wouldn't they be manning the sails and trying to steer the ship? Perhaps more importantly, the fact that Jonah is sleeping is in direct contrast to the pagan sailors who were praying. Jonah, one of God's chosen people, the only person on the ship who knew the one true God, was not praying, but sleeping. Was this because he was confident that nothing would happen to him? I don't think so, and his actions, which I'll cover in the next episode, reveal this. I think his behavior is another manifestation of running away. He's not facing reality. It's almost as if he just wants to curl up under the covers and hope for the problems of the world to go away. Rick Warren pointed out in a sermon not long ago that Jonah was running from God and completely content with it. His point, I believe, was that our feelings alone should not determine our obedience to God. Clearly, we can feel just fine in complete disobedience. Verse 6 ends with the captain of the ship waking Jonah up and demanding he pray to his God that they all might be spared. It is this situation in particular that reminds me of another very similar scene from Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41, where Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Lake of Galilee, and a great storm comes upon them. In both stories, the professional mariners are afraid they are going to die. Both stories have someone sleeping in the boat, and finally both stories have that sleeping person being woken up because others in the boat are afraid they are going to perish in the storm. And that's where the similarities end. In Mark 4:39, we see Jesus stand up, rebuke the wind, and immediately the storm ceases. This type of power, especially in the Hebrew culture, was only attributed to God. As Psalms 107:29 reads, "He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed." In the preceding verse of the same psalm, it reads, "Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress." In the scene from Mark, the disciples had just woken Jesus and asked, "Don't you care that we're going to die?" Jesus responded by calming the storm and then saying to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" How should we read that? Is Jesus saying because they called on him they have no faith? No. I think it's closer to Jesus saying, "Remember who you are and who I am. Remember that I am with you. If I'm not worried about it, why are you?" Did you know that worry is a form of pride? As it reads in 1 Peter 5, verses 6 through 7, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all of your anxieties on him, because he cares for you." When we take our worries and focus on them, we're trying to take control. What we need to do is humble ourselves. It's a conscious act of giving our worries and concerns to God. Jesus is encouraging his followers in the boat, and anyone that will follow him in the future, that faith is not just something we know. Faith is trusting a person. Trusting Jesus is who he claimed to be through his teachings, his miracles, his death, and his resurrection.